Hi, everyone. My name is RJ, RJ Spina. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Llewellyn, for putting this together. I'm excited about it. My first book that I wrote, Supercharged Self-Healing, a revolutionary guide to access higher states of consciousness that rejuvenate and repair, comes out November 8th. I'm sure Llewellyn is going to let you know about that. I just want to talk real briefly. I'm going to give you the slightest background I can on myself, and then I'll get to something far more interesting, which is the ego and how it's created. A few years ago, January 23rd, 2016, to be exact, I became paralyzed from the chest down, permanently paralyzed from the chest down. It was an infection that had gotten into my spine. Doctors had no answers to that. Diagnosed with multiple diseases, very, very ill, on top of my body no longer functioning. Couldn't feel it. Didn't look good. Prognosis was not good. So I awoke from surgery, and believe it or not, I told everyone that I would heal myself, and I began to explain the mechanics behind healing and how it actually works and what I was going to do, and then I would, believe it or not, walk in exactly 100 days. And on the 100th day, I actually walked unassisted. As crazy as that story sounds, it's absolutely true. There's a video of that on my website. It's time-stamped, so you can actually see the progression, how rapid the progression was from total permanent paralysis from the chest down to walking up a huge hill in the beautiful mountains of Kauai. Those of you familiar with Kauai. So I highly recommend it. So that is on my website, ascendthefrequencies.com. There's pictures of my MRI. There's surgeon notes in there, completely verifiable and totally true. This is authentic healing. It's not medical fiction or a spiritual canard, so to speak. Okay. So with the briefest of backgrounds, so please forgive me about that. Why don't we get into the topic, right? What is the ego and how is it formed? Because there is such a massive correlation between what we call the ego, and I'm going to give us a new definition of the ego that I feel is more accurate and actually explains it in greater detail, because we've kind of used that word, and it really encompasses a few things, as well as the word soul, which really encompasses a few things too, at least from my tangible experience, my personal perspective of what I've experienced through my own higher states of consciousness. So what is the ego, right? And how is it formed? Okay. It is incarnation that creates the ego. And incarnation is an accelerant for the evolution of consciousness. Okay, it's probably the best way to look at those two things, right? The ego is created through incarnation, and incarnation is simply an accelerant for the evolution of consciousness. Okay, so the ego, how I like to say it, is the fictional character that we create based upon a lack of tangible self-realization, enlightenment. They're really the same thing. The ego is the totality of our misperceptions, misunderstandings, and misidentifications. That's another way to say it. Okay. The foundation, right, for the ego is the misidentification with the form factor. The body, okay? Human being is a form factor, right? It's this, right? As opposed to an alien form factor. Okay, so this is the foundation of the ego, is identification with this. Okay, super important. Because of this deep identification with the body, there's something that happens we could call a contraction of consciousness, right? And we become completely reliant with just the five senses, the five physical senses, right? We've often heard, if I can't see it, smell it, taste it, or whatever, then it doesn't exist, right? Okay, nothing could be further from the truth than that statement, right? So we start to become completely reliant upon the five senses, right? So we misidentify with the body, and then all we start to use are the five senses that are part of this body, right? Now, the five senses are attuned to the lowest three frequencies within the physical universe. They band together to form sort of one experience. We call this a 3D reality. We call it three-dimensional. It is my experience that it's actually frequencies. We're not actually in the third dimension. We're actually in the first dimension, but we're in the third frequency. Energy exists within frequency, and dimensions are a unit of measure that house frequencies. This is just my experience with that, okay? So as we become misidentified with this body and totally reliant upon very, very, very limited sensory perceptions, right? My understanding is that our five physical senses only perceive literally what I've been instructed to say is 0.003 of what actually exists. Okay, so we're about to form what we call the ego based upon what the five physical senses are able to perceive, which is 0.003. So we can start to understand how inauthentic this human persona really is in comparison to the self, to what we really are, what we eternally are, this changeless, immortal creator being. Okay, so foundation is this body, and now we have five physical senses. Now what we do is, because we are misidentifying with the body and we're not rooted within the self, and again, the ultimate would be, we'll call it self-realization if you like. We're not rooted there. We're rooted with this body and its five senses, right? So we don't know who we are. We don't know why we're here. We don't know how we got here. We don't know what the point is, right? So what do? We create a story based upon misperceptions, misunderstandings, and misidentifications. And essentially, this will be the information that we are able to perceive with our five senses. And we call these things beliefs, concepts, ideologies, so-called knowledge, right? Okay, so we begin shopping, I'd like to say, shopping for beliefs, shopping for concepts, shopping for ideologies, shopping for so-called knowledge that we can then reach out and identify ourselves with, right? We see something, oh yeah, that's me. I'm going to choose that. And it can be anything. It can be religion. People do this with politics, political parties. They do this with the roles that they play, say for a job. I'm a this and I'm a that, right? So we're identifying ourselves with a small piece of what is this belief, this ideology, right? This concept, this role, right? Meanwhile, these things are slivers of the totality of what is, right? If you added all the beliefs, all the concepts, all the ideologies, added them all together, they would not be equivalent to one complete whole self, which is what you are, which is what I am. Right? So we now start shopping for concepts, ideologies, and roles, and then we identify ourselves with these things. You could think of, here's a silly analogy. I like silly analogies. You can think of Spider-Man shooting his spider web and attaching himself to this belief, this role, this ideology. Right? This is kind of what we do energetically, literally. This is what an attachment is. Right? So quick recap, foundation is the body, now the five senses. Now we start shopping and we start creating a character based upon our sensory perceptions. Right? Okay. Now, in order to then process anything, right, it is always in context to our identifications, right? So in order to think, there must first be a belief. Every thought is in context to some sort of belief. Okay, this is super important to understand. I want us to deconstruct this formation of the ego and how it operates. Right? Because this is probably the single most important understanding that you will ever have. Because the goal of every incarnation is self-realization, right? Which we could say is the transcendence of the ego, or what I call the ego-mind identity. Okay, so our five physical senses are perceiving just a minute amount of information, right? We call these things beliefs, concepts, ideologies, and roles. We then attach ourselves to these things. And then in order to process any information, it is always in relation to the identifications that we have. In fact, we can't process any information unless we've identified with it. We come across something that we say doesn't pertain to us. We don't really understand what's going on with it. We don't take it in at all. There's no processing. There's no understanding whatsoever. It's because there's no identification to it. Okay, makes sense? Right. Okay. So we now have beliefs, concepts, roles, and ideologies that we've identified ourselves with. And again, these things are slivers of the totality of what is. And what you are comes before all of these things. Right? So we're starting to form our character. Right? We're starting to form our human character. And this becomes the way in which we think about ourselves, feel about ourselves, and in turn, how this translates to the outer world and our place in it, or outside of it, for that matter. Okay, so the mind, or what I call the finite mind, right, is the processing of the information that comes in, right? So there is no sort of higher consciousness going on. We're going to get into that. None of that is going on. This is just sensory perception and the processing of sensory perception. And this is the lower consciousness, or the finite mind, okay? And we can only process what we identify with. So the processing of information is the mind, right? And we call that thinking, okay? So thinking is not knowing, just like believing is not knowing. Knowing is the self. And because we're not anchored to the self, we're left with processing. We are left with thinking. We are left with figuring out. We are left with creating a character instead of knowing ourselves. So what we end up knowing are our beliefs, our concepts, our ideologies, our identifications. Meanwhile, the self goes unexplored, not understood. No real gnosis with a G, self-knowledge, knowledge of the self. That is missing in this life. And then we continue creating and adding to this character, this human character based upon misperceptions, misunderstandings, and misidentifications. So this is sort of a very rudimentary understanding of the ego, but it is essentially based upon, it occurs through incarnation, right? Disconnection from the self, right? We then identify with this, and of course the five senses, and then everything the five senses perceives. We pick and choose what it is that we want to identify with, right? This belief, this concept, that concept, this ideology, that ideology. It doesn't really matter. None of them are you. You're more than all of them added together. But then we start picking these things, and then we process information through that set of misperceptions, misunderstandings, and misidentifications. Beliefs, concepts, and ideologies have nothing to do with what is. They're simply human misunderstandings based upon very limited five senses and identification with the physical form or the body, right? And so we then create the character. We create the ego. Now, for me, it's really an ego-mind identity because they all go together, right? So all your processing, mind activity relates to thinking, and thinking is always in context to a belief, right? And you choose the belief that you identify with. So you can start to see how this is a looped program, right? This is what the ego is. It has nothing to do with the self. The self exists way before all of this. And believe it or not, the self is what's giving birth to this, unfortunately. Right? So you can see how this is a looped program. So I like to say that the ego, I call it the ego mind identity, or the EMI. And if we looked at it from a completely detached perspective, if we were able to go so deep within ourselves okay? And we could actually see the machinations of the mind, and this is possible to do this. And we can actually see how it functions. We can sort of see sort of the quantum mechanics behind all of that. We would actually start to see that the ego-mind identity is a limitation program that runs by thinking. And what has always been the answer to the transcendence of the ego? Meditation, non-thought. What a coincidence. Yeah. So the self is meditation. It's what exists prior to the creation of the ego. And so the challenge is to return to this self when it is most difficult, which is exactly where all of you and me are right now, within the lowest frequencies of the physical universe, or what we call 3D, which is really the bottom three frequencies that band into one kind of thing. They give us a 3D experience. Right? So the key is to stop this program, this looped program of limitations that runs by thinking, and return to the self, right? Reside within the self, as the self, for the self, by the self, right? Now, I want to just talk 5 minutes. I'm sorry. All we have is another 4 minutes before questions, okay? And I'm sure there's going to be questions, but the incarnation process, I'm going to give a very quick, silly analogy, okay? Most of us have heard that we come from our higher self, the Godhead, the Oversoul. I call it our totality because it's everything we've been, are, and will be. But you can think of the higher self, okay? So this right here, I know it's my fist, but think of it as an octopus, okay? Right? And think of an octopus dropping down a tentacle or some of its tentacles to see what the water is like a little beneath it. Okay, so we are kind of like that. We're the tentacle, we're the projection, right, of our higher self. That's what a soul or an aspect is. And by the way, it's about 2.5%. What you and I are, about 2.5% of this. Okay, and so this is what gets projected downward. Now, the problem with this is that what we come down is called the Hara line. We've all heard that term, the Hara line, the white tube. This is the tube that people see in near-death experiences. This is also the tube that we come down in. It's the tube that we're going to leave out when we leave this form factor, when we leave this avatar behind, right? Because it's attuned to the lower frequencies. It's part of this lower frequencies. We're not the body. It stays right here, right? Obviously. Okay, so it's this projection downward, and as we are projected downward, right, we come down through this very thin tube. And once we get down here, now I want you to think of a balloon. Well, let's go to another silly analogy. I want you to think of a balloon, and I want you to think of a balloon filled with air and then tied off at the top, knotted at the top, right? We've all seen balloons just kind of floating aimlessly, untethered to anything, and just kind of floating around. Okay, that's you and me. Completely disconnected from the self and disconnected from what we really are and where we come from. That's kind of what happens. And because we're so disconnected from the self, we literally create a character, the ego-mind identity, with the foundation being the body, then the reliance on the 5 senses, and then we shop for beliefs, concepts, ideologies, and roles. We attach ourselves to these things. And then any information that comes in is processed based upon our identity. That's how our mind works. And the activity of the mind is thinking based upon our beliefs, concepts, and ideologies, our limitations, these slivers of what is, a sliver of the self. So the true self, or the true personality, is your higher self, right? And we cover it up through misperceptions, misunderstandings, and misidentifications. And it's completely understandable because it's very difficult to be here. Just like that balloon who's been tied off and is just kind of floating, untethered, not anchored to the self with a direct connection to the higher self. And so we're left with a human personality, right? Okay, so the key to this, by the way, is to ascend the frequencies, which is why I named my website Ascend the Frequencies. The key is to ascend the frequencies, is to go back up, open up the hairline, allow the information that exists in the frequencies above the human form factor, and allow that to come in, okay? And this increases our communicative abilities with our higher self. This is where we get access to, we could say, boundless amounts of information that cannot be accessed by the five physical senses. This is where past lives and future lives exist. This is the realm of wisdom. Right? And this is the realm of where the Ascend the Frequencies healing technique was created in order to unparalyze myself and reunite with my higher self, however you want to term that. Okay, so if I don't stop now, I'm just going to ramble. Anyone who knows me knows that I will ramble for eons, literally. Okay, so we can start questions at any time. I know there's a bit of a delay, and I'm sure that was a lot of unusual information. I tried to make it as concise as I could, and I apologize if it wasn't or if it was confusing. There's this information is in great detail in the book that comes out in November. And of course, it details the healing technique that was created that countless people I've helped with using that. They use it for themselves, and they've been able to bring themselves back to a state of health, inner peace that they've never experienced before, expansion of their own consciousness by using these energetic exercises and protocols. You can think of it as inner Tai Chi. That's a way to say it, right? Learning to understand the self and to master ourself. And by the way, the self, the sentience, what we really are, sits between the heart and the spine, by the way. That's what we really are. That's why when people indicate themselves, they always point, let me lower my camera. They always point right there to the center of the chest, me. No one ever points here because this thing is just a translation medium for the five senses, and it just translates it. This is where you actually reside. Okay. Let's see. Do we have any questions? And you can ask me, believe it or not, you can ask me anything. Hopefully it pertains to what we talked about. But, okay. Profound. Jennifer, profound, thank you. You're very welcome. Do we need roles in order to live in a community with others? No. Good question. You just need to be yourself. You just need to be present. That's all. Just to be fully here now. What you are is more than enough. You don't need a role to limit yourself. You don't need to live as a concept, an ideology. You're more than that. Just be yourself. And how do we do that? Just be present. That's all. There's nothing to live up to. You're just here to realize yourself. Self-realization. Right? You're just here to realize yourself. And believe it or not, that's the ultimate. Right? All religions say the same thing, which I find interesting, right? They all say that the ultimate is enlightenment or self-realization. All of them say that. Right? And if we look at some of these beings, look at how they live. They live in the mountains. They live in a cave. They live in a robe and underwear and don't do anything. And that's the ultimate. Something to think about, right? Okay. Lara, I do believe we are characters. Our soul creates to learn through, much like us playing an MMO game. But how do we know what the soul's goal is? I feel the desire to grow and learn very strong and feel very disconnected. But if the soul has chosen me to be here, how do I know what to do in my life? Okay, that's a good question. Okay, so the pursuit, self-mastery, self-realization, however you want to say it. By the way, self-mastery is a little different than self-realization. That's the next book. But if we think self-mastery is outside of ourself, if we're trying to gain or acquire something and it's outside of ourself, then we have it backwards. We have to turn inward and go in. The life plan, right, is within you. It's not out there. I'm not even going to say that there isn't an out there, but then this will be another conversation. But it's inward. The life plan is within you. And it's actually roles, concepts, and ideologies that get in the way of the life plan. Those are actually the distractions. Those are the things that create the ego mind identity that serve as the only impediment to your own self-realization and your life plan. So it's actually the opposite. Believe it or not, everything here is backwards. We're told to create a human persona and not be ourselves, right? Everything here is backwards. Okay. Let me see. Oh, let me scroll back up. Oh, love this, by the way. Very good information. Could you listen to you all day about this? Oh, getting the book. God, oh, thank you very much. I could speak to all of you all day, forever. I do. How interesting and inspiring. Thank you very much. You're very welcome. I love that question. It's amazing. Thank you very much. It's very complimentary. Don't start building my own EMI, okay? Is part of the ego developed as a defense or protective mechanism? Absolutely. Absolutely. Osha, if I said your name correctly, I apologize if I haven't. So it's because we're not tethered to the self. Okay, let me just give an analogy. Okay, this is easier. Do you ever drive? I'm sure you have. Do you ever drive in a neighborhood that you're not familiar with? Okay, you kind of drive slowly because you kind of don't know where anything is and you're really, really tentative. You could say there is a level of fear involved with that, right? Okay, that's what it's like to be here. Okay, this is not home for any of us. Okay, it is difficult to be here. All of you are so brave and none of you give yourself enough credit. You have all of my attention, all of you. So yes, it's based upon fear. The two main things that the ego mind identity gives us is fear and vanity. Because the ego demises when the physical body demises. So the ego or the ego mind identity will do anything to keep the body alive because its existence stops once the physical body dies. So the ego is obsessed with keeping the body alive. It's obsessed with the body because of the misidentification with it. Okay? And the second thing it gives us is vanity. Right? The beliefs, concepts, and ideologies that we keep acquiring, right? These identifications, right? That builds the intellect, right? And then we lay claim to all these things. So the two main things that the ego mind identity gives us is fear and vanity. Right? We would all do well to get rid of the ego mind identity. It is the whole key. And wait till you understand how this relates to sickness, disease, and ill health, which I can't get into today. You're going to be floored. Completely different understanding. Completely. And again, this is what I've done with myself. Okay, and lots of other people. You can see it on the website if you want. Okay. Awesome information. I'll have to dive into it. Thank you. You're very welcome. You're very welcome, Pamela. Exactly. Everything we need is within us. The cure for all that ails humanity is the soul. It is only the truth that heals. Nothing is from the physical. Nothing originates here. And that's why there's nothing curative in this realm. Thank you. Will this book ever be an audiobook? Yes. Yes. Blackstone Publishing will be doing the audio. What is your website? My website is ascendthefrequencies.com. Ascendthefrequencies.com. And my email is rj@ascendthefrequencies.com. So feel free to email me. I teach people and work with people all over the world. This is what I do. Right from this chair, by the way. Okay. I have a moderate form of fibromyalgia and my fear of it is getting worse. So I find my already withdrawing from fun parts of my life, fear and vanity. Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. Kelly, there's so much we can do with fibromyalgia. Okay, I wish the book was coming out sooner. But send me an email. I offer all these classes and courses. I work with people all over the world to help them with their healing, to help them with their self-realization. That's what I do. Battling after effects of cancer. I've worked with tons of people with cancer, after cancer, everything. People that were diagnosed with, and then we've been able to sort of push it back down into the basement so it doesn't bloom. There's all sorts of things that can be done with everything. When you understand the self, okay, there are no limitations. The self is unlimited. The self is whole and complete. And part of the ego mind identity limitation programs are sickness and disease. Those are part of the limitation programs. Okay. Thank you. Everything you are saying really resonates. Thank you, John, because it's true. How about for losing weight? Oh, I'm going to give a talk about that for sure. I can't do it now, but yes, when you stop identifying with the body and you learn how to work with your energy, it's not going to be a problem at all. Any help for depression and anxiety? Christy, that is my main focus right now with the absolute, the real pandemic is the mental crisis, the mental illness crisis that is going on. Yes, I've helped people endlessly with severe anxiety and severe depression. Sometimes they're cured. I don't want to use the word cured, forget it. Sometimes they don't have that issue anymore after 5 minutes. Okay, it has to do with energy, being able to manipulate energy and control energy, or what I call real magic. Real magic. And once we understand how to do this, okay, anxiety and depression are things that'll be laid by the wayside, because that has to do with not having control over our energy, being stuck in a looped pattern, right? The story that we tell ourselves. You want the fastest way to stop anxiety and depression? Pretend you just arrived here. No past, no future. The energy drops right back down. Now there's nothing swimming in your mental body or your emotional body. Try that. It's one of the little magic tricks. Okay. Oh, Jessica, thank you. You're very welcome. Munchika, you're very welcome. Jericho, you're very welcome. I really needed to hear this today. I feel hopeful already. Thank you. I'm so glad. Watch the video of me on the website. You can see me completely destroyed. You can see the MRI. You can see the doctor's notes, complete paraplegia. These things are possible. These things are possible. And this isn't hope. Hope is worthless. I'm giving you the actual instructions. You will know what to do. You won't have to guess. You won't have to wonder. Okay? My overcoming permanent paralysis is your permission slip to do the impossible for yourself. The link on the website doesn't work. Oh, goodness. All right. I'll have to look at that. You are wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Instagram, Ascend the Frequencies 12. Ascend the Frequencies 12, the number 12. 1, 2. I would love to talk to you about losing weight. Of course. RJ at ascendthefrequencies.com. Just send me an email. Okay? Or many thanks. Llewellyn, thank you so much for putting this together. I'm sorry I went over a little bit. My apologies. Thank you all very much. I'm sure I'll see you all soon.